Hello and welcome to another episode of Sandy Killer Projects. Today we're going to be doing the front and rear brakes on a 2017 Jeep Cherokee high altitude latitude two-wheel drive 3.2 liter. We're going to go over the BRF and BRG brakes as best as I can, and hopefully some of the details into the sizing of the calipers. So the very first thing you want to do, which is partially already done, is pop the hood and take the cap off of the brake reservoir. And the reason why is because once you compress the calipers on the brakes, the fluid will back up into the canister, and you'd rather have it come out than break the seal in the top of the container. So you don't have to take it off and move it out of the way, just take it off and set it right back on top of it. The next thing that we're going to do is go around into the inside of the car. Alright, so once you have the cap off the brake reservoir, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to go into the car. With your foot off of the brake, you're going to turn the car on into the run position. Screens will boot up. If you have this large touch screen, this is the way you're going to be going through it. You're going to go into the apps. You're going to go into settings. And then you go into brakes. You want to put it into service mode, but the car is not going to let you put it into service mode until you turn the brake off. So put your foot on the brake, depress the electric brake, and then come up here where it says service mode. It'll ask you if you want to retract calipers. Okay, parking brake is retracted. To reset, press the brake pedal and activate the brake switch. So as of right now, the car is in service mode. It has retracted the rear brakes as far as it'll go. Alright, once you have the e-brake released and in service mode, you need to jack up the car. I jack it up off that cross member right over there. The reason why I did this ahead of time is because I've already done other videos where I've shown how to jack up the car. I also have a jack stand behind that. I like to balance the two. It's just the way I've done it for years and years. So now we need to talk about the BRF versus BRG brakes. So there are a couple of different ways that they talk about these when you're looking for parts in the auto parts stores. One of them is 278 millimeters or 320 millimeters. 270 millimeters works out to 10.9 inches, and 320 millimeters works out to 12.59 or 12.6 inches. So in this particular case, these brakes are the 12.6 inch brakes. There's the wheel codes which get really confusing, which is the BRF versus the BRG. BRF, I believe, is the standard brake. But one of the things I can't figure out the differentiation is because they also make a single cup caliper brake. I can't tell you the difference whether the BRG has the single cup or the BRF has the single cup or not. None of the reference material I could find would actually explain if that is a situation. So in this particular case, these are the BRG brakes. They are 320 millimeter. And they are dual piston calipers. The way that you can tell whether or not your car has dual piston calipers is this. If it has two little U's in it or makes an M, this is a dual piston caliper. If it did not, this piece in the middle would be missing. There'd be one single opening in between it. And the caliper itself would be significantly smaller. So the BRG brakes are considered to be the vehicles that have the towing package available on the car. Whether or not you purchase the towing package on your car or not doesn't really make the difference between the two. It's whether or not the car has the availability to have the towing package put on it. Okay, with all that being said, when you're doing this, you need to make sure you know which of those you have. If you don't know if you have BRF or BRG, the for sure way to check what size wheels you're going to have is taking a tape measure to it. You can do this with the wheel on if you want to as well, but put a tape measure to it, and if the calipers are 12.6 inches, that's a 320 millimeter caliper, 320 millimeter disc brake. Now, a lot of times the 278 versus the 320 is what's talked about in the back versus the BRF, BRG brakes. Your fronts and your rears are not going to be different sizes. So if you have 278s in the front, you're most likely going to have 278s in the rear because they don't put two different sizes front and rear. So the other point that I wanted to go over too is the brake rotors themselves. Generally, manufacturers put a number on the rotor somewhere that tells you the minimum thickness of your rotor. In more modern cars, they seem to have been going away from that and taking the number off of it, because in most cases they want you to buy new rotors. This particular car has about 120,000 miles on it. It's mostly freeway driving. The brakes have the potential to have a lot of issues with them. The best thing I could tell you is if you still have good thickness, you don't have a lot of rippling in your brake, you don't necessarily have to replace them. In this particular case, there's no real rippling. The brake pads are just starting to make a squeak from the squealer tabs on the brakes, which is the indicator that I decided to change them because I do a lot of commuting in this car. And I believe the wheels that are squeaking are the rears, not even the fronts. So with that being said, I'm not going to change the rotors on this. If you are planning on changing the rotors, in this area right here, there are two T55 bolts that will remove the caliper and the caliper mount bracket. It'll take the entire assembly off. I'm not going to be doing it that way. Today I'm going to be taking off the caliper slide bolts, which are here and in the same location directly below it. That will remove the outer part of the piston caliper assembly, and then I can compress the calipers back. So these bolts are a 9/16 or a 14 millimeter. If you're going to take the entire assembly off, it's a T55, and they're here and here on the back. So next, when I come back, I will remove this assembly, taking off the slide bolts, and show you what's going on in there. Alright, now we have the caliper up and out of the way. This is the caliper bracket. These are your brake pads. There are two slide bolts, one on the top and one on the bottom. There are mounts to go into the back of the slides that keep the calipers attached to the slide bolts. These bolts, 9/16 head, I took the bottom one off, I loosened the top one, and I literally just rotated the caliper up. So as you can see from this, which let me move the camera just a little so you can see a little better, there are two pistons in the top of this. The way to get these far enough back to allow the new brake pads to go in is to take C-clamps and put it into the openings. You run the C-clamps all the way down into the back of the cup and then press them in. Okay, so the problem with doing it like this with the dual piston is you need two of them. If you push just one, the other one will start to force itself out. If you don't compress the caliper cups, the brake pads won't fit into the position that they have to go into once you put fresh brake pads in. Alright, so I had a little camera malfunction while I was trying to show this, but you have to press in both caliper cups at the same time so that the other one doesn't end up forcing out. This is also why we took the cup off of the reservoir, because as you're doing this, you're pushing fluid back into the system, up into the reservoir. You don't want it to run out of space. So we just take these and slowly walk them down. Once they get all the way down, then there's enough room for the brake pads to actually fit into the opening. And these will bottom out. That's how you know when you're far enough back. And then the system won't like fill itself back up unless somebody pushes the brake pad. So once this is done, you can take these off. I don't know if you'll be able to tell from that or not, but the caliper cups are now pushed all the way back, as far back as they'll go into the housing. Okay, so now we have to work on the brake pads. Okay, so your brake pads themselves, they have these little wires that go into the back of them. They're just used to keep the brake pads from opening up too much when the brake isn't being used. These just slide out of the holes. Okay, so as I was saying, now the brake pad can come out. Just grab a tool to help walk the pad out, and then the pad comes off. As you can see, these front brake pads are actually still in pretty good condition. I am going to go ahead and replace them though, because of how much mileage this car has on it. So this is the inside one, also still good. I've probably got about 3 to 6 months left on these brake pads. It's still worth changing. Okay, I purchased the Raybestos Element 3 EHT1843H. That fits on this brake pad setup. So with these, it comes with a kit. The kit has all the hardware that you need for any style of front brake setup. Just make sure that when you change parts out, that you change out the parts that you have, not ones that don't match up. There's also these little tabs down in here. They can be changed out, or you could keep the old ones in as long as these are intact. These just wiggle up and out. This is the piece for the bottom one. This is the piece for the top one. They're almost exactly identical. They're just flipped 180 degrees so that one is the top and one is the bottom. These help keep your brakes in place, and then these help lock them in when they're in place, and these are also your squealer tabs, in this case on this brake. This is what makes the noise that goes ee when your brakes are worn out. This, like I said, this setup isn't worn out, so these are in good shape. So next I'll put all these parts back in with the new fresh stuff and start installing the caliper back on. Okay, so these brake pads go in fairly easy. It's just a matter of replacing the parts. These are the tabs that go in the top and in the bottom, depending on which side and what part you're using. The one thing that's a little bit odd with these is these brake pads have a little piece on the top and the bottom that you actually have to install on them. So these guys would clip on. The pointy one goes on the top and the round one goes on the bottom. So once you have all those in, it goes back together and looks exactly like it did before. You even put the little wire tabs on the back of it. Once all that's done, the one thing that I'm going to recommend, brakes don't like oil, especially hand oil. As you can see, there gets to be little bits of marks just from interacting with everything. I take just some brake cleaner and hose them all off. Clean towel, wipe that off. It's just to take the handprints and the hand oil off. That's it. If you don't do it, your brakes have a tendency to squeal more. I've already done the backside, so I'm not going to do that also, but the spray the front, the rear, wipe them off as best you can, and then make sure you get all that oil off of them. and then at this point the brake caliper will rotate down. Now if you didn't do that step where you compress the calipers, the brake caliper will come down and it'll stop and it won't fit because the caliper cups are in the way. But from this point, this should just drop right down, and then I'm going to tighten up this upper bolt and then reinstall the bottom bolt, and the caliper will be back in place. I'm going to go over a couple of the things. I did the slide pins. Those are 14 millimeters, as I've already said there. They get torqued down to 32 foot-pounds. If you took off the T55 that removes the whole bracket, those get torqued down to 129 foot-pounds of torque, because that is the whole assembly. They're much heavier bolts. Those bolts on the slides are much smaller. If you put that kind of torque on them, you'll spin the heads right off of them. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to go over was brake bleeding. I can't actually do it in the setup that I have because it's just me in the garage at the moment. I am going to bleed the brakes because there's no real way to get your brake pressure back to where it should be without bleeding them. But I'm going to walk through how to do it. From in the cab, you have somebody go 1, 2, 3, hold the brake pedal down, and while they're holding down the brake pedal, the next thing that you're going to do, okay, while you have the person over there doing that, you take the rubber cap off of the brake bleeder. Brake bleeder is right here on the top, pointing towards the front of the car. You take an 8mm wrench, you put it onto this, and while their foot is depressed, you crack this open. You don't unscrew it, you just open it until the pressure bleeds out. Okay, so the trick that I use, it looks really funny, but you spend enough years hanging out in a garage and maybe even drinking in a garage, this is the easiest way to do this. So while you have that, you take a disposable cup and a straw. I usually put the cup on the ground, and then I put the straw on the end of the nozzle and point it towards the cup, and then crack the line open. That will then run fluid into the cup that I have below it, and it will take the air out of the lines. Generally, you do this process up to 3 times. So you have the person inside of the cab, pump, 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 hold it down, and then when they're holding it down, crack the line, run the fluid out, then tighten the line back up, and after enough times, the brake pedal will actually get hard under the person's foot, and that's exactly what you're looking for. That shows that you've put the brake pressure back into it. And I also recommend that you put the cap back on the reservoir and top off the reservoir to where it says it's in the full mark before you do that. So at that point, I'm going to put the wheel back on, and I'm going to start working on the other side. I'm not going to film that, but I will film the rears once we get to the rears. Okay, so here we are in the back with the tire already off. I've already got the jack and the jack stand underneath it. I wanted to show a few things before I start disassembling stuff. If you notice on the back, there's a whole bunch of brake lines right here. It actually is that way because this mechanism right here is actually your electronic e-brake. So it's actually what drives the brakes in when you set the parking brake. On this one, it's a little bit different than the other one. You do have a Torx bit to take off the entire assembly. Again, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take off the slide pins and rotate the brakes out of the way. And if you notice on the rear, these are single piston and only has one little U in it. That's common because your rear brakes don't do as much braking as your front braking does. For whatever reason on this particular car, these brakes are actually wearing out before the front brakes are. We're gonna start on these here. So I will start working on pulling the slide pins off and rotate it up out of the way and show you all what's going on in there. Okay, so now looking at this side, it's going to work almost exactly like the fronts did. There's not a whole lot of difference to it. There's just a lot of stuff in the way because of the fact that you have ABS units, You have your electronic brake stuff. There's a lot of hoses and lines. That's why this won't pivot and stay up out of the way. You can disassemble it all off the back if you want to. There's a hard brake line that goes right along here. It's attached to a bracket that's along the top. There are 2 bolts along the back, and these bolts are not 14 millimeters. These bolts are 10 millimeters. They're little teeny guys. It's easier to do it this way than it is to do it to disassemble the whole thing. But you got to realize too when you're doing it that to get the brakes out, you're going to have to like peel this up out of the way and then grab the brake unit or the brakes out of the assembly, because it's not gonna work with you. This caliper is going to be fighting you the whole time. So this is the easy way to get in and out of here. Again, with this, brakes are 320 millimeter. The brake rotors are 320 millimeter. There's not damage on either side of this. It's all in really good shape. I'm not going to replace this. And again, these rears don't get used anywhere near as much as the fronts do. So the fastest, easiest way for me to do this, take the bottom off, loosen the top, peel the caliper out of the way, and then deal with your brake pads and your brackets that attach everything that have to be replaced. All this stuff comes out. It comes with all new hardware, and I'll show you which brakes we're going to be putting on in a second. Okay, so I've already changed the pads out. I figured I'd show you which pads I used. They are, again, Reassembling Element 3. They are the EHT1734H brake pads. So now that I have the brake pads in, I'll explain a few things that I didn't necessarily explain in the last doing the fronts. There are these little metal brackets that go into them. On the front ones, you also install parts on the top and the bottom of the brake pad. On the rears, you do not. These actually have a riveted on. It actually comes on the original stock ones too. A little riveted tab. This little guy right here is actually your squealer. This is what gets in the way and makes noise to tell you that your brake pads are worn out. They're already installed on this. This piece right here is an anti-squeal bracket. They generally are loose, but as the brakes get hot, there's a little bit of glue in here that actually causes it to glue down to the brake pad. On the stock ones, they basically work the same way. You don't have to do anything with the stock ones. Why did I use the Reassembling? Mostly just because they were the best in the price range for what I was looking for. I'm not particularly keen on one brand or the other. I do usually like Reassembling, but Power Stop brake is good too. There's lots of other brands of brakes out there that'll work just fine. Okay, so now that we have the brake pads in, both in the front and the rear, the caliper's got to go down. So this is what I didn't go over in the front one, and doing the fronts, but the caliper won't go down. That's why we use the clamps to crush down the piston itself. This guy, it's got to get pushed back in far enough to make clearance. So even though you have your brake pad all the way up against your rotor on both sides and it's tight, there's no way to get this guy down because the brake is actually extended out. So this works the same as the others. There isn't like even though it has little notches in it, it doesn't like twist in. You just compress it back with the C-clamp, and it will slide down over it. So next I'll have this all reassembled. Okay, now that the brake is reassembled, I got to show you a few things. This right here is your brake bleeder for the rear. Once your brakes are changed, you do need to bleed them. So this is where you're going to stick some sort of straw and a wrench on that guy right there. Also, I didn't mention this when I did the other side, but when you go to pull the bolts out of the slides, this guy right here is the nut that backs it up. I didn't have any issues with it to where I needed to back it up, but if you do, I believe it's a 17 millimeter. You also need something that's thin profile because there's a metal bracket that's in the way. That's basically the other side of what catches this thing's in a little accordion looking thing that keeps the slide pin clean and oiled so that it doesn't get dirt and stuff up into there. So on this upper, there's a nut on this end, and I already showed you the bolt for the other end, but if you look behind that nut, right in here, right in there, there's another nut. So if you're going to try and loosen the top, that's how you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to loosen this one that holds the ABS line in, and one that holds the caliper on the slide pin. So that one's the one that you loosen up. So now everything's assembled. The next thing that I'm going to have to do is bleed these brakes out, and then I'm going to do the other side, obviously not on camera, and then I'll finish up the video. Alright, so now that we're almost done, there's one very important thing that needs to happen before I go too far. I need to make sure that there is brake fluid in here. The manufacturer recommends .4. Any .4 will do. You don't have to buy some special stuff. This car doesn't require .5. If you have .5 or want to use .5, make sure that you cycle all the fluid out to switch the entire system to .5. .5 is significantly different. .3 and .4 are basically the same thing. .4 has a slightly higher boiling temperature. That's the only real difference between the two. Then make sure this cap's on good. One last very important thing that I am going to mention before I say this is done. If you are going to do this brake change, as I've just done, you need to drive the car. Just because you bled the brakes doesn't necessarily mean that the brakes are holding. I've actually seen in multiple instances where people have done a brake job, either not bled the brakes or bled the brakes improperly, and then either gave the car to a customer or drove their own car out into the street and then got nailed by a car because they had no brakes. Make sure you start up the car, put it in gear, and roll back and forth a little bit in your driveway, and make sure that you at least have basic brake function. Then take it out onto I would recommend residential street or someplace remote, and move the car gently back and forth until you're comfortable with moving it at speed, and then move it at a little bit of speed and then brake. If you don't do that, your car may not have functioning brakes. So that's the safest way to handle it and how to do it. So that's pretty much it for this video. Hope this helped you. And as always, I say like, share, and subscribe. We are really doing well on subscriptions and hours. We do need more subscriptions, so please subscribe. And we'll keep making more videos. All right, thanks.